University Pathshala for Linguistics. The module is Issues in Aptitude, Proficiency and Assessment Part 2. I am Shruti Sarkar, Professor in Linguistics, Department of Linguistics and Contemporary English, English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. In this unit, we will look at the reasons for individual variation in second adult language education. If you remember, in the first unit, we showed that child language acquisition is not affected by issues like attitude, motivation, style, etc. And the only reasons for individual variation was either impairment or certain external factors like social class, gender, education, and so on. So in the unit, what we are going to look at is these external factors that affect the rate of language learning. So let us start with the notion of proficiency. If you remember, we said that the notion of proficiency, assessment, these are concerns which are often heard with relation to second language acquisition and do not come into the literature of first language acquisition. So nobody talks about whether there is proficiency in first language and how to measure it. These concerns are irrelevant for first language acquisition. So why does this become so important for second language acquisition? Why is it interesting or important to see what constitutes the learning of first language? What do we test? How do we test? And whether these tests reflect or predict proficiency in that language. So the concerns that we raise have many reasons. First, if you look at the scholastic curriculum, in every field, first language, second language is learned, there is a syllabus, there is a curriculum, and there are tests. But these tests are not predictors of how well the learner uses that second language. So they are not reflected. For example, a person who gets a 90% on a test may or may not be able to use the language in actual contexts. If you remember, in an earlier unit, we had talked about Krashen's distinction between acquisition and learning. And this is what we are looking at right now, that what a child produces in a test is often the learned system, and this does not translate into the acquired system. So let us look at what are these individual variations in second language acquisition. What causes these individual variations? We have three particular things that we want to talk about in this unit. One is the aptitude, the second is attitudes and motivation, and the third is strategies that a learner uses to learn a language. Let us start with aptitude. Aptitude is a term that we hear with relation not only to language, but we also hear this with relation to music aptitude, aptitude for music, aptitude for painting, aptitude for games, a lot of aptitude. What does this term aptitude mean? Aptitude typically refers to the natural ability to pick up or acquire something. There are people who learn 7 to 8 languages. There are some who stay with only 2. Even if they are exposed to that language on an everyday basis, they do not pick up that language. But there are others, particularly children, who pick up as many as 5 languages in India with equal ease and mastery. So the aptitude is a term that we use to indicate language learning. Now each child or each adult has a different aptitude for language learning. But how do we measure this aptitude? Is it something that is measurable? Is it something that we can test and find out who has how much of aptitude to language learning? And even if we do, how does this affect our teaching or learning systems? Let us look at one particular test that has been developed to look at language aptitude. And this was developed by Karen, and it was called the Modern Language Aptitude Test, which had different kinds of segments. One of them was phoneme coding. That is, if you hear a language, are you able to find out what are the phonemes of that language? Where do the phoneme boundaries occur? That is something that you can do through analogy with other words, which means that are you able to discern rules from regular patterns that you hear in the language? Then whether you are able to work out inductively the rules of the language. So this was a test which tried to find out whether you could measure aptitude, and it was found that the results on this test and the results on a language test correlated heavily. Therefore, in one way it could be said that aptitude is something which can be measured and which correlates with language ability. The second point that we look at in terms of what indicates an individual variation is the attitude and motivation to learn a language. This term attitude and motivation was used first in 1970s by Lambert and Gardner, who tried to find out what is the motivation to learn a second language. And they identified two particular kinds of motivation. One was the instrumental motivation. That is, when you are trying to learn a language for a particular pragmatic purpose, either to get a job or if you have to go abroad and you need to speak to people, or you're traveling to a foreign country and you need to just book a hotel, stay in a place as a tourist. So there must be a reason, particular utilitarian reason to learn a language. Or the motivation could be that I love these people and I want to integrate with them. So that is the integrative motivation. So there are two kinds of motivation. One is instrumental, the other is integrative. Earlier, when the entire enterprise of language teaching and learning was not very well known, people thought that the best way to learn a language is to integrate themselves with that language and that community. But it very soon came into the picture that in learning a second language, it is not necessarily true that people want to integrate with that language, but the language has certain benefits, financial or economical benefits, for which people are learning that language. So it was shown through multiple research, which was replicated all over the world, that if one has instrumental motivation, the learning is much better and much faster than when it is integrative. So we were talking about motivation. What does this motivation mean? It is just not a mental thought. It is more than that. So it has to translate into some behavior that we show towards the task. If I'm motivated to learn a language, then I should be willing to learn the language. I should be eager to learn the language, which might translate into some kind of physical activity. For example, I practice more. I try to find out more. If I'm trying to learn the language and its words, then I ask people to give me more information. So there's some kind of behavioral trait which is attested along with the mental ability. And it was shown that this instrumental motivation is something that affects seriously your language learning. If you are motivated, then you learn the language. So the motivation can come from the family, from your friends, from the community, because the particular language that you're trying to learn has a higher status in the society that you live in, or it could be because of the teachers, the material, the curriculum, the methodology used, which means that teachers have a major role in trying to motivate learners to learn a language. And this is something that we know from our personal experience, that if you have had a bad maths teacher, you will end up hating maths. But if you had a good maths teacher, you would love maths forever. So one teacher is enough to motivate you. So the teachers have a major role. The material that you're using in class, the kinds of activities that you're doing, brings about a positive motivation towards the language and learning. So the attitude and motivation actually affects how you learn a language. So one person who is motivated will learn the language better at a faster rate than the person who is not motivated. The third important point that brings about a difference between individuals in terms of their language learning is the strategies that they use to learn the language. What do we mean by the strategies? Strategies is a term that we use particularly in cognitive science because we say that whatever we are learning, we are processing. The mind is processing information. So if you're processing information, you also have a plan on how to process the information, how to use the information that you have processed. So before you, let's imagine that you have to organize some activity. You work out a plan. You work out a strategy. What would be the best strategy to do this, which will give you immediate effect, which is less cost effective and more cost effective and less time consuming. So we have a plan or a strategy to attack a particular task. So one research strand was to see whether good language learners and poor language learners are using the same strategy. One. Second, is it the quantity of strategy that is being used is what is making the difference between a good and a weak or poor language learner, or is it the quality of the strategy that is being used? For example, if there is a word that you don't know while you're reading a text, what are the possible strategies that you can use to understand the word? One would be rush immediately to the dictionary, try to find the word. Two, look around, find a person who you think would be able to help you, ask for that word. Third, try to guess the word from the text itself. Fourth, ignore the word completely and just read on. These would be the four possible strategies that you have. If you are a good learner, the best strategy that you would be using is to try to guess the word from the context. And if you're able to get a fair sense of the word, you would read on. And later, when you have the time, check or consult a dictionary or a person to ensure whether what you understood is right. But this would not be required because by the time you have read the entire paragraph, the meaning would become clear. A poor learner would probably skip the word and assume that it has no importance in the text. And this would be perfectly fine if the word is peripheral to the meaning of the text. So that was one part of the research that we see in strategies, is whether there is a difference in the strategy that is being used by learners to learn language. And finally, what happened was people worked across the world to find out what are the strategies in learning words, in putting together a sentence, in learning sounds of a language, in learning the meanings of a language, and all kinds of things. And over a period, Rubin put together a set of strategies which are called three-tiered strategies. One is the cognitive strategies, that is thinking about the task, solving the task, consulting. Then the metacognitive strategies, which means where you actually think about what would be the best way to solve the task, rather than just solve the task. So you work out a plan and you think about your own learning process. You say, okay, this is the strategy that I used which did not work, so probably I should be using a different strategy. So you self-evaluate your own strategy and your own learning systems. The third set of strategies is socio-effective strategies, where you put together a group and do group study, peer interaction, and consult and talk to people and find out what their problems were when they were learning, and learn from other people's experiences. So these are three areas where individuals and their own motivations, their own internal factors affect language learning, the way they learn the language, which affects the output. So when we are looking at proficiency and we try to find out whether they are proficient in the language, let me explain the term proficiency here. Proficiency, for example, is different from what you write as a school exam. The school exam is tied to a syllabus. And there are certain things that are taught in the textbook which are tested. Proficiency test is a test which does not look at any syllabus, but it is a test of your language ability. So it is not tied to any syllabus. It is basically dependent on, I expect a particular person at this age or at that level to have this language. So a test is created to see whether you are able to solve those tasks. So this is delinked from any curriculum. There is no curriculum. It is basically testing how much you know about the language. So this kind of proficiency testing is what you find across the world. Different systems have put together these kinds of proficiency tests across languages to see whether they have a standardized test. So a few of the standardized tests that we know is the TOEFL, IELTS, the CEFR. These are the standardized tests that we have of proficiency. Particularly, these are used as diagnostic tests because this allows you to enter a university where the language is the major medium of instruction. So unless you understand the language, you can't enter these universities, and therefore they are used as diagnostic tests. So these proficiency tests basically divide the students or learners in terms of bands. Whether you have bands who are near native bands, which is the highest level. So you are behaving almost like a native speaker. You know almost all aspects of the language, the basic ones that you need to know. To one which is the beginner learner. So you have a scale. So for example, the CEFR, the Common European Framework reference, is basically one where you start from C. C is the highest level, C, B, A, and so on. So C is what you would expect a university student to have. A beginning learner would be A. So you actually grade the students in terms of these bands on the basis of a proficiency test. But have you ever heard of these bands for a first language learner? Have you heard of bands like this in India for, let's say, Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, Tamil, Bengali, which Hindi, Gujarati, Tamil, or Bengali learners take? We have never heard of these kinds of bands. Nobody bothers about these kinds of tests because you assume that everybody learns the language in the same way. So there could be no scope of individual variation. Whereas the moment we think of second language learning, we have these bands. The bands come into effect, the individual variations come into effect. So when we look at these distinctions between first and second language, we realize that proficiency, aptitude, assessment, all these are around the notion of a second language. And this has nothing to do with the first language. One point that we want to bring about in proficiency is that proficiency is primarily related to age when it comes to first language. So when you look at first language, people will talk about MLU. What is MLU? Morpheme Length Unit. Is how many units does a child use in his or her sentences. Initially we find that a child starts from 1 MLU, that is 1 word. Gradually you will find that he moves to 2 words. Then you find that he is using, for example, when you say mummy goes home, mummy is 1 unit, go is another unit, goes ES is another unit, home is another unit. So there are 4 units now. So the MLU now is 4 units. So it is related to age. So initially children start with nouns, gradually go to verbs and then adjectives, then prepositions and adverbs and so on. So as your MLU count increases, you will find it reflects syntactic complexity, how long your sentences become. After the MLU of 4, it doesn't matter after all. And what you find in second language acquisition is that this MLU, here also, children start with nouns and move to verbs in second language acquisition. The MLU again comes into play. But this MLUP feature in adult language acquisition is not seen so effectively like it's seen in child language acquisition. Because adults already know that you need to have a noun and a verb in a sentence. So the first ones that you use is a noun and a verb. Though the verbs may be wrong, the nouns will be wrong. So you don't see the same kind of structure. So there is a noun advantage in second language acquisition. However, these seem to change with adult. So in this unit, what we looked at is the different ways or different reasons why second language acquisition shows individual variation, and these are learner central and centric and context specific reasons for it, whereas in child language acquisition none of these factors seem to have.